8 mice were placed inside what seemed like a perfect world. 4 males, 4 females. Unlimited food, unlimited water. No predators, no disease, no danger of any kind. 5 years later, every single mouse was dead, and not one of them died from anything a veterinarian could diagnose. This was Universe 25, one of the most disturbing social experiments ever conducted. Back in 1968, American scientist John B. Calhoun created what he called a paradise for mice. Every corner was filled with soft nesting material. The temperature stayed perfectly controlled. The enclosure was cleaned on a strict schedule. The mice themselves were some of the healthiest breeding specimens from the National Institutes of Health. Everything they could ever need was provided. Calhoun wasn't just studying mice. He was obsessed with one question: what happens to a society when life becomes too easy? By the time he built Universe 25, he had already spent nearly 20 years trying to answer it. He had run experiment after experiment inside forests in Maryland, barn enclosures, and laboratory rooms. 24 different versions, each one designed as a paradise for rats or mice. No food shortages, no predators, no reason to struggle, and no escape. Yet every single experiment ended the same way. First, the population exploded. Then violence increased. Mating behavior became chaotic. Eventually, everything collapsed into apathy. And finally, the entire colony died. Calhoun had witnessed this pattern 24 separate times. Universe 25 was supposed to be different. It was meant to be the perfect experiment, the cleanest version, the final answer nobody could argue with. So he built it inside a federal research laboratory in Maryland, a 9-foot square enclosure. Along each wall were stacked apartment-like nesting boxes connected by wire mesh tunnels stretching from floor to ceiling. Calhoun called them walk-up apartments. Every apartment had constant access to food. The hoppers never emptied. The water bottles never ran dry. By his calculations, the enclosure could comfortably support nearly 3,800 mice. It would never even come close. On day 1, he placed 8 mice inside, closed the lid, and waited.
For the first 104 days, almost nothing happened. The mice explored their new world. They learned the layout. They figured out where to sleep, where to eat, and who belonged where. Then, the first litters were born, and the population began to grow fast. About every 55 days, the number of mice doubled. Everything seemed to be working exactly as planned. By day 315, more than 600 mice were living inside Universe 25. The apartments became crowded, the ramps filled with constant traffic. Mice slept in large piles and competed for the best nesting spots near the top. This was the moment everything started to fall apart. In a normal mouse colony, when the population grows beyond what the territory can support, the extra mice simply leave. They migrate. They find new territory. They build new lives somewhere else. But inside Universe 25, there was nowhere to go. No new land, no new opportunities, no new roles. The young males, unable to claim territory or establish themselves, began drifting toward the center of the enclosure. There, they formed lifeless clusters, groups of healthy mice doing absolutely nothing. Calhoun often stood above the enclosure for hours, watching them. They weren't sick, they weren't starving, they weren't injured. They simply had no purpose. There were no territories left to defend, no rivals left to challenge, no meaningful place in the colony. Even more disturbing, when one of these males was attacked, he often didn't fight back. He would simply absorb the attack, then quietly get up, walk a short distance, and lie down again, as if nothing mattered anymore. But not every male responded this way. Another group emerged, and they behaved in the complete opposite manner. These mice became hyperactive, restless, aggressive. They raced through the enclosure faster than any others. They forced their way into nests already occupied by dominant males. They ignored the normal courtship rituals. They attempted to mate with any female they encountered. Even violent attacks from stronger males failed to stop them. The colony was beginning to split apart. Some mice had completely given up. Others had become wildly impulsive. Both groups had lost their natural place in society, and that was only the beginning. The deeper the experiment went, the stranger the behavior became. The females responded differently. Instead of becoming aggressive, many simply withdrew. Those that couldn't find a stable place in the colony climbed to the highest apartments
and isolated themselves. They stopped interacting with other mice. They stopped mating. Eventually, they stopped reproducing altogether. Then Calhoun noticed something even stranger. He called it the behavioral sink. Food was available everywhere. Every feeder was completely stocked. Yet the mice began crowding around only a handful of feeding stations. The others sat almost untouched. They refused to eat alone. Even when an empty feeder was overflowing with food, many mice ignored it. Instead, they waited in packed crowds for access to the same few locations, as if being surrounded by other mice had become more important than the food itself. Day after day, the overcrowding got worse. Not because resources were limited, but because behavior had changed. Then things took an even darker turn. The mothers who were still trying to raise their young began to break down. Protecting a nest inside Universe 25 required constant effort. The dominant males who once defended their territory became exhausted. Many eventually stopped protecting their families altogether. The burden fell entirely on the mothers. They had to nurse their pups while constantly fighting off intruders. It became too much. Some mothers abandoned their babies. Others scattered them throughout the enclosure. Some could no longer recognize which pups belonged to them. A few stopped recognizing them as their own at all. And in the most extreme cases, mothers began killing and even eating their own offspring. Infant survival collapsed. In some parts of the colony, fewer than 1 out of every 20 newborn mice survived long enough to be weaned. Looking back on the experiment, Calhoun wrote that this was the point where the colony suffered its first real death. Not the death of the body, but the death of society itself. The mice were still alive, but the social structure that allowed them to function as a species had already disappeared. The next generation paid the highest price. The pups that survived were raised by mothers who had little interest in caring for them. They grew up without healthy social behavior, without strong parental examples, without learning what a normal mouse life was supposed to look like. And when they became adults, they behaved unlike any mice Calhoun had ever studied. Something fundamental had changed.
The males of this new generation never fought. They never competed for territory. They never courted females. In fact, they barely interacted with other mice at all. Their entire lives revolved around just 3 things: eating, sleeping, and grooming themselves. Over and over and over again. Because they never got into fights, their fur stayed perfectly clean, perfectly smooth. They looked healthier than every other mouse in the colony. Calhoun gave them a name, the beautiful ones. From the outside, they looked like the ideal mice, healthy, calm, flawless. But beneath the surface, they were functionally dead. They had no interest in reproducing, no desire to socialize, no curiosity, no ambition, no purpose. Their brains had developed inside a world where every meaningful role was already taken. There was nothing left for them to become. So, they simply opted out. By day 560, the population reached its highest point, around 2,200 mice. It never grew beyond that. The decline had already begun. On day 920, the last successful pregnancy occurred inside Universe 25. After that, not a single new mouse was born. The colony continued to age. The beautiful ones kept grooming themselves. The isolated females remained alone in their upper apartments. Small bursts of violence still broke out, but they no longer served any purpose. They were just echoes of a society that had already collapsed. One by one, the mice grew old. One by one, they died, and no new generation came to replace them. Then, on May 23rd, 1973, 4 years and 10 months after the experiment began, the final mouse died. Universe 25 was completely empty. Calhoun later wrote that the colony experienced 2 deaths. The first was the death of the spirit. The second was the death of the body. And the first death happened years before the second. When Calhoun published his findings, people immediately drew one conclusion: comfort destroys civilization. Unlimited abundance must eventually lead to collapse. A life without struggle must end in self-destruction. The image of the beautiful ones, perfect-looking, peaceful, and quietly going extinct, became one of the most powerful metaphors of the late 20th century. Urban planners referenced it. Religious leaders quoted it. Politicians on every side of every debate used it. Anyone warning about the decline of modern society found something in Universe 25 that supported their argument. But here's the part most people miss. That wasn't actually John Calhoun's conclusion. His real message was hidden inside his paper. In his own words, he argued that for a species as socially complex as humans, a similar collapse wasn't just possible, it was logical. If the number of individuals
capable of filling meaningful roles, greatly exceeds the number of meaningful roles available. That changes everything. The real problem wasn't comfort, it was the disappearance of purpose. As the population grew, there simply weren't enough meaningful roles left for every mouse. The strongest males had no territory left to claim. The younger males had nothing worth competing for. The mothers were forced to defend nests alone. The next generation inherited a world where there was no place left to belong. The structure that gave every individual a reason to participate slowly disappeared. The food never ran out. The water never ran out. What disappeared was meaning. Comfort didn't destroy the colony. It simply removed the friction that once gave life purpose. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. Calhoun wasn't a pessimist. He wasn't predicting humanity's inevitable collapse. He spent the rest of his career trying to prevent it. He kept building new universes. He kept changing the conditions. He searched for one missing ingredient, the thing that could make paradise sustainable. Because he believed it existed. He believed humans could succeed where the mice failed. Calhoun argued that as our physical world becomes more crowded, our future depends on expanding into what he called conceptual space. New ideas, new roles, new ways to create value. He called this ideational generativity, a complicated phrase for a surprisingly simple idea. If old purposes disappear, create new ones. If old roles become full, invent roles that never existed before. Because purpose isn't something you find, it's something you build. And that's what separates us from the mice. Universe 25 still stands as one of the most unsettling experiments ever conducted. 8 mice, a perfectly designed paradise, 5 years, complete extinction. Not because they lacked food or water or safety, but because they lost the reason to participate in life itself. The mice never had a choice. We still do. What happens next is up to us.